Are you someone who is into podcasts? Perhaps you want to have a really cool library where you can find some great podcasts to listen to on your commute to work. Or maybe you're looking to create one yourself. Well, let me tell you about Anchor. It's the easiest way to make a podcast, alright? It's free. It has creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or your PC. Anchor will also distribute your podcast for you. Complete ease, hassle-free, so that way you can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, as well as many more outlets. You can also make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. Okay, folks? Everything you need to make a podcast in one place. It's fantastic, all right? And if you want to get started right now, all you got to do is download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. All right, hello everyone. Welcome back for another wonderful episode of Just a Glimpse. This week, you all have voted for Marvel vs. DC. So let's get into it. Now, this is a debate that's been going on between which is better for the last 80 years. And everyone's going to have their preferences. Now, for me, I love DC. Hands down, if I have to choose one over the other, I will always choose DC over Marvel, okay? But let's kind of go into more about both sides, so that way we kind of have a better understanding. There's going to be some of you out there that are super fluent when it comes to the comics. You know, you'll just follow along. And then there'll be those of you that do not read the comics, but you are familiar with the characters. Maybe you've seen a couple movies, what have you. Let's kind of go into some background. This way you guys can kind of, form your own opinions, maybe learn something new that you didn't already know, things like that. Now, these two publishers have been around for a good 80 years. When they first started out, they were known as Timely Comics and National Alliance Publications. Alright, so that's where they got their start, and then they've developed into what they are today, which is Marvel and DC, or Detective Comics. When they first started out, they had very distinct differences in how they did their storytelling with their characters. Today, those lines are blurred and they're super similar to one another, but when they first started out, they were clearly different. DC at the time, they focused on characters that were basically like gods. Characters like Superman, Wonder Woman, The Flash, Aquaman, characters that were just super strong. Maybe not so much for Flash, but Wonder Woman already had all her super strength, and Superman is just ridiculous with all his abilities that he has just because he's an alien and the effects of the sun. And then Aquaman, crazy strong as well. So they basically created this godlike way of telling their stories with their characters. And then eventually, they create Batman, who is a human, but he ends up being extraordinary because he is able to use his intellect and his technology to push himself to be able to keep up with the super-powered peers that he works with without, being limited by just being a human. So he goes way above and beyond. So he's way up there too. Whereas when Marvel first started out, they were more focused on showing regular humans, your average Joe, characters that then would be given some sort of superhuman ability, usually by some form of either an accident happened to them, or scientific experiments, or just weird things would just happen to these average dudes, and then they would become basically superhuman. So that was their little way of starting things out. Peter Parker getting his superhuman abilities through getting bit by the spider. You have Tony Stark, you know, and his, you know, using his money and intellect to create, you know, Iron Man and just be like this, you know, really strong abilitied individual. You have Bruce Banner, you know, having to deal with his alter ego, and, you know, he ends up getting turned into the Hulk. They do have their godlike characters too in Marvel, you know, like Thor. They focused more on, you know, when it comes to Thor, it still kind of fits that, you know, average Joe human approach, just because Odin ended up banishing Thor to Earth because he wanted to teach his son a lesson in humanity. So he ended up being lesser than his full god self. So it kind of still kind of works in there, but that's basically how they differed in the beginning. Now, you can, like I said, these lines definitely have blurred today with how these two different publishers are representing their characters. They're basically doing the exact same things now. It's a lot of monkey see, monkey do. So you're either going to love one or the other based on certain characters that you're going to fall in love with, and then you're going to choose a side based on certain characters. That's usually how it falls into. Now, one of the biggest things that has happened between them is they started out with their own characters, and they were doing their own thing. But then what happens with competition? They see what's working for the other guy, and they end up wanting to do it too. So this created a lot of copycatting. If you look at lots of different characters between the two, you could tell, you know, that and they're both guilty of doing it. They're both guilty of doing it. I honestly couldn't tell you who's done it more than the other, to be like, yo, this one, you know, this one's, you know, likes to rip off the other one more. I honestly can't tell you who's done that. There's so many characters out there in comics and different story arcs and stuff that it would take a lot of research and work to actually go in and on the timelines and see who copied who the most. We're not going to do that. I will say they are both guilty of doing it. For me, I personally think Marvel started it by copying DC first. Since DC has been around longer, it would make sense that Marvel would have to copy some of the successful things that DC has done in order to survive in the industry. Some examples would be, let's say, DC already had Deathstroke back in, I believe, like 1980. Deathstroke was Slade Wilson. And then, like a decade later, in like 1991, is when Marvel's like, yo, we can do that too. So they decide to make their copycat spoof character Deadpool. And his name is Wade Wilson. That's a known. Like, everybody knows Deadpool is a spoof of Deathstroke. Everybody knows that. Alright? Their names are super similar. Like, Slade Wilson, Wade Wilson. Like, come on. Alright? They're both mercenaries. They both have a two-toned suit. Deathstroke being black and orange, and Deadpool being black and red. They both use firearms. Deathstroke has a sword. Deadpool has two katanas. They're both really smart. They both have a healing factor. Now, there is a difference. Clearly, you know, Deadpool's healing is way superior. He's able to be completely decapitated and can, you know, regenerate from that, whereas Deathstroke cannot. Comparatively, they you know, they're still very, very similar. When it comes to intellect, Deathstroke is then superior. He is a master planner. He's able to carry out his missions with lots of precision, whereas Deadpool, he tends to be super unpredictable, and he focuses more on just confusing his opponents and just being ridiculous. I don't know the term I would like to use, but I guess he's kind of like a smartass. He talks a lot, and he uses that as part of his charm, I would say. A lot of people just love the way that Deadpool just talks to people and to himself. So there's that. When it comes to how they got their powers, Deathstroke, he got his powers through the military, through some super soldier serum. And Deadpool got his thanks to some Weapon X program in Canada. So, you know, some more similarities. So, you know, it's things like that. It's a lot of copycatting. Let's see here. DC also created the Doom Patrol first. And then, like, literally within, like, 3 months of that, Marvel's like, yo, we can copy that idea. So they created X-Men. All right. But then, like I said, they both are guilty of it. So in another case, Marvel created a character called Namor, and 3 years later, then DC then creates Aquaman. Okay, so in this case, Marvel created a character before DC, even though, like I had mentioned, the other examples where Marvel copied DC. Another time when Marvel copied DC would be Red Tornado. DC had the character Red Tornado at least 2 months before Marvel created Vision. So it's another case of copycatting. I'll go into a lot more detail of other examples later. I'll just kind of list off some other ones. When it comes to like super stretchy people, DC had Elongated Man, whereas Marvel had Mr. Fantastic. There's Catwoman for DC, and then Black Cat for Marvel. I'll go into those more in detail later. Another one would be Hawkeye for Marvel and DC's Green Arrow. Those are clearly copycat characters. Marvel has the Nova Corps, and DC has the Green Lantern Corps, so those are definitely, clones of one another. There's also Ultron versus Brainiac. For a long time, Superman was the flagship for DC. Alright? Because Superman was where they got started before Batman, came to be. And DC has 2 flagship characters today, which is Superman and Batman, but when they first got started, their flagship character was Superman. And Superman was selling more comics than anything that Marvel had at the time. It was the front runner. They made the most revenue. It was the best-selling character in the comic industry during the time. Of course, Marvel, they needed to try to compete. So there were, several occasions when they tried to create characters to be as powerful as the Man of Steel himself. One example for that would be Marvel created the Sentry back in 2000. And basically he has the power of 100 exploding suns or some nonsense like that. There's the alien Hyperion, and then there's a character called Supreme, and he was exposed to some meteorite and basically and then it had some kind of supremium or some nonsense on it, and a lot, you're gonna see a lot of characters within the comic world universe, for the superhero comic world universe, that are going to have exposure to some sort of radiation or meteorites or things like that. So this is a case where, that was one of those. Supreme also has a sister with identical powers, kind of like how, Superman and Supergirl, they're cousins. So they kind of ripped that off. Supreme's arch nemesis is called Darius Dax. He's a brilliant, manipulative, evil business tycoon, much like Superman's Lex Luthor. So it's things like that. There's a lot more copycat things within Marvel and DC, but that's just one of those things where you're going to see one copy the other, and then it's more of which version do you like more, and that's totally fine. Now, for me, like I had said, I prefer DC. If you wanted to say, now there's also the argument on which is better based on their comic sell, how many comics they sell, and they go back and forth. If you go way back to when they first started out, like I said, Detective Comics was superior. Okay, so Superman was leading the industry at the time. Most of all of his comic book sales would always average around 500,000. And then later on, and then when they had Batman got created, Batman was dominating. Batman was making almost 900,000 sales per issue. Now that's huge. Today, nothing comes close to that. Batman doesn't make as much money today as he did back then. If you were to look at, let's say, the top selling issue, let's say if you go back to 2017, just go back a few years, right? Marvel had the top selling issue, which was their Marvel Legacy issue 1, and that was selling 300,000 copies. Whereas, if you, like I said, Superman back in, let's say, like the early 70s was averaging over 500,000, and Batman, was getting almost like 900,000, sales per issue. Huge different gaps between back then when comics were huge and today they've been dwindling. Even if you look at the news, you'll see that DC has canceled out a lot of different comics recently because they're not making money. They're just not making money. It has nothing about them not being good. They have really good stories. They're well written. The art's fantastic. It's just comics today aren't selling like they were, 30, 40, 50 plus years ago. And it's just because of the change of entertainment. Back when the comics were super selling, they didn't have the video games. They didn't have blockbuster, live action films back then. So they only had their comics to get these stories. Whereas today there's so many different ways to get a story based on your favorite characters. Now people prefer watching movies, TV shows, animated like cartoons, or even playing a video game over reading a comic book. A lot of the younger generation don't even read the comics. They only know these characters because of the movies and the video games, or cartoons they grew up on. A lot of them have never read a comic book, and that's just the way it is today. So it's completely different. Anyway, so DC started being like the front runner when it came to comic sales, and then it's gone back and forth after that. Marvel, and if you go look at recent years, Marvel, they were in the top 10, and DC wasn't. So in 2016, Marvel had seven different comics in the top 10 spot for best-selling comics. The other 3 were, with some smaller publishers. And then a year later, DC held 6 of the top spots in the top 10, and Marvel only had 4 at the time. Okay, so they've been going back and forth. I don't even know what's the top, like, in the last year or two. I don't even know. I didn't bother looking because, like I said, comic sales have been dropping off. DC is canceling stuff out. It's just the world we live in today. Other ways that you could argue about which is better is going to be the different ways that the comic books had their adaptations between TV shows, animated series, as well as live action films. Now, if you go back to when most of us that are arguing this grew up, you got to keep in mind that the MCU film universe that's been going on, that was only created within the last decade. They didn't exist when we were growing up. We didn't have these big blockbuster movies then. So when you picked a side between Marvel or DC, those were not a factor. Okay, the younger generation today, they might say Marvel's better because of those movies, because they didn't read the comic books. This is what they know. And I would say, yeah, if you're looking at movies today, MCU definitely has some amazing blockbusters out there compared to DC. But if you go back when we were growing up, the vast majority of us that are within my age gap, within my generation, we didn't have those movies. So for me growing up, looking at the different movies, DC was better because, so I grew up with, the old Batman films, with Michael Keaton and Val Kilmer and George Clooney. I grew up with those movies. So I would be like, DC won hands down because those movies were amazing. And, Marvel didn't really have anything that cool, in my opinion, during that time period. Later on they started making the X-Men films, and they were all right. They weren't amazing. I grew up with Batman the Animated Series, back in the 90s. That cartoon was amazing. All right, and the animated movies for Batman were amazing. All right, for when it comes to like Marvel, I did watch like the Amazing Spider-Man cartoon. was really good. I did like the original X-Men cartoon was pretty darn good too. So both sides had really good, really good stuff when it came to the animated side. I would still say the Batman animated series is probably one of the best, adaptations for a comic out of all of them, during the time. I would argue that was definitely better than anything Marvel had at the time for an animated show. The animated series for Batman was amazing. And then it had a lot of spin-off movies, like, Mask of the Phantasm and Batman and Mr. Freeze, Sub-Zero, and things like that. It was really, really good. So that's just what I grew up with. So for me, DC was the stronger influence on me, because I just really love Batman, and Batman was killing it in the 90s when it came to like cartoons and movies and things. Batman was the king. Alright, Marvel could not compete with that. So that's why I strongly love DC. And there's lots of other characters I love too. I mean, within DC, I grew up watching the Justice League and stuff like that too, so I got introduced to a lot of characters. Now keep in mind, when I was a kid, I didn't read the comic books. I didn't start reading comic books until, my adult years, in my late 20s. That's when I finally started reading comics. But yeah, it's still, when I start reading comics, I'm over here reading, things for Batman, the Batwoman comics, the New 52. Oh my gosh, I loved them. I want to get the Harley Quinn comics with Poison Ivy. I want to read those. So there's a lot there that that I'm slowly getting into. I'm definitely got a huge backlog because I didn't read comics growing up, but I definitely do prefer DC. Now, when it comes to Marvel, though, I don't want people to think that I've cast Marvel aside, that they don't interest me, they don't have anything, because that's not true. I absolutely love Spider-Man. Spider-Man is by far my all-time favorite character, and when it comes to the Marvel Universe, I absolutely love him. I love the side characters. But then again, this is going to go into an argument or whatever. This is going to go into a conversation that I'm going to add later about how they're basically, it makes sense that I like them too, because they're basically the same. I do like X-Men. I think X-Men are pretty cool. Now, I am not a fan of Wolverine. I do not like over-the-top Mary Sue kind of characters. So like Superman, don't care for him. I don't like characters that are so over the top powerful or can't really be beaten. They're boring. All right. I like a character that's going to have struggles and has to try to overcome things. Characters like Wolverine, Deadpool, Superman, even Wonder Woman, they don't have the same kind of struggles because they're freaking ridiculous. They can't die, they can keep regenerating, or they have like so many different kinds of superpowers that they're like it's just ridiculous. I can't with them. I can't. So Wolverine, I can't stand him. All right, but when it comes to X-Men, I really liked Storm growing up. So when I watched the X-Men cartoons, Storm was amazing. I absolutely loved her. I thought she was really, really cool. Jean Grey was an interesting character. Cyclops. X-Men was cool. I just don't like Wolverine. And when you ask people who their favorite X-Men character is, 9 times out of 10, they're gonna say freaking Wolverine. And I'm like, well, that's boring, because Wolverine, he's a Mary Sue character in my eyes. He can keep regenerating. You can't really beat him. So it's like, he doesn't matter to me. He's boring. I want a character that can die, that can fail. Someone that can be shot and just keep coming back up. That's boring, because they're like, okay, well, you don't have an obstacle. And I feel like Marvel taps into that more. I feel like Marvel taps into that more with characters just being over the top. DC's guilty of it too. They started it with Superman. They're definitely guilty of it too. But yeah, it's just, I can't with that nonsense. Deadpool is probably one of my most hated characters ever created. I can't stand him. If I'm just to look at my 2 favorites, so Batman for DC, and I do love a lot of other characters within the DC, but I'm not going to go into them all. I just want to focus on my two favorites for both. Alright, so my favorite for DC, hands down, is Batman and all the characters related to Batman within his comic verse. And Spider-Man for Marvel. Now, these, I feel like I really fall in love with them both because they're basically the same, yet different. You're going to be like, how in the heck how the heck does she figure they're the same? Here, let me tell you why. Batman and Spider-Man are both the flagship frontrunners for their publisher. Batman is the best-selling comic character for DC. Superman is still a flagship character, but he can't compete with Batman. And then Spider-Man is definitely the flagship for Marvel, and I would say, you know, with how things have been going in recent history with movies and adaptations, Wolverine would probably be the second one. I love them both, and they have a lot of similarities, okay? One of which would be like their origin. Both of them lost their parents. And then there were some differences, you know, whereas Bruce Wayne, he witnessed his parents being gunned down before his very eyes in a back alley during a mugging, while he was a child. Peter Parker lost his parents when he was really young, but they don't really tap into that. They focus more on his relationship with his aunt and uncle. And him losing his uncle, and, you know, when he's a teenager, you know, basically becoming an adult. I think he's around 18 at the time because, you know, they focus on him going to college and stuff. So when he's a teenager, you know, there was, you know, this chance accident where his uncle ends up getting killed. That was basically his fault, which pushes him to, you know, push to become Spider-Man. And the death of Batman's parents, you know, pushes him to become Batman. So in the end, they both deal with great loss with loved ones. Both of them have no parents, okay? And you can even include the uncle for Peter Parker because he was basically a father figure. So they both have their origin of losing their parents. They took two different routes, but they led to the same outcome, basically. Once they become Batman and Spider-Man later on, they end up creating relationships with people, and they end up going through a great loss together. They both do this. The example would be, for Spider-Man, would be with Gwen Stacy, and for Batman, it would be Jason Todd. Okay? Both of those characters, Gwen Stacy and Jason Todd, became involved within the lives of Spider-Man and Batman. They were fully aware of their real identities. They you know, Gwen knew, you know, Peter was Spider-Man, and Jason knew that Bruce was Batman. All right, similarities there. Difference between the two is Gwen was a love interest for Peter, whereas Jason was more of like a son figure. After Dick Grayson, you know, kind of moved on, was kind of like a son figure for Bruce. Both Gwen and Jason were killed by the arch nemesis of our hero. So basically, Spider-Man's and Batman's, you know, arch nemeses, they go and they kill, you know, Gwen and Jason. They want to, you know, put them in a dark place, push them over the edge, get them to cross the lines that they don't cross. It's the same. It's the same thing. They go through the same thing. So, both heroes, you know, they end up being super distraught because of the death of their loved one. They both have the same sense of duty to not give up and to not let the enemy, you know, push them over the line, get them to break, get them to either, you know, quit, you know, hang up their, you know, hang up the mask. See, another way that they're basically the same is both stories have similar ideologies, similar tragedies, but they become two different kinds of heroes. So the ideology is that they both, had the loss of their parents, and they took different routes to become who they are. Peter, he likes to, be witty and to try to make himself feel better. He likes to joke around and, try to have a light attitude about how he does things. Whereas Bruce, he's very, serious. He's brooding all the time. He's just dark and more violent in nature. It's interesting when you take two characters that underwent the same tragedy, but it shaped them to be completely different people. Spider-Man fights crime because he does it for him. He chooses to do that for himself, whereas Batman fights crime because he's forced to. He feels like he's being tormented by his past, and so he has to do this. They both have the same rule to not kill, and they work really hard not to cross that line. Now, yes, there are the arcs where they do cross the line, but if you just look at it the whole, no matter all the fights they've had with all of their different enemies and things they've had to overcome, they don't cross that line. Okay, the bad guys get sent to to jail, or to, in most cases when it comes to like Batman, they all go to a mental asylum, to Arkham instead of prison. Spider-Man sends his dudes go to jail. Batman thinks violence is the only way he can fight crime. But he has to make sure he doesn't cross that line and he doesn't actually kill anyone, otherwise he would become that which he, is angered by, which is the death of his parents, the mugger who shot his parents. He doesn't want to become that, because otherwise Batman feels that if he did kill someone, he would never be able to recover from the trauma of doing that act, as well as the trauma that he's still dealing with the loss of his parents. So, if he crossed that line, if he killed someone, his mental state would never be able to recover. He would just be done. That's his fear. Whereas Spider-Man, he fights crime. He likes to, stay light and loose and, be, comical. And he does it because he wants to set an example. When he lost his Uncle Ben, there was the whole, great power brings on great responsibility. So he wants to show that he can go and help people and do good, to be a positive example and role model. So that's how he differs from Batman. Batman is traumatized and it's made him very cold and violent, while he's, tries to still do good. Whereas Spider-Man, went through the same great loss, but instead of being angered and traumatized by it, he uses that as fuel to make him a better person. And if you look at the two, Spider-Man has actually saved more people than Batman. Batman, he focuses more on just taking out the big enemies, Bane, Joker, Mr. Freeze, whatever. He focuses on the big threats that he has to deal with in his city. He doesn't really spend too much time helping the little guy. If the little guy is in trouble, during a fight, he'll go and he'll help the little guy in the heat of the moment. Like, he doesn't go and just take time helping the little guy, whereas like Spider-Man does. Spider-Man, when he's not fighting, Mysterio or Sandman or anybody like that, he actually goes around and he helps people. He'll help people, prevent car accidents. He'll go and rescue people from fires. He'll go and, just be a good Samaritan. He goes above and beyond to help as many people as he can, regardless of the situation. Batman doesn't go patrolling and go and help, and go and help people like that. Now, he does do it. I'm not saying he doesn't do it. I mean, there are times when he'll stop, muggings or whatever, and help people out, but that's not what he's looking for. He tries to let the cops take care of the smaller crimes, and he focuses on the big ones, and if there happens to be something around him while he's doing something, then he'll act on it. Spider-Man is always stopping crime, no matter how big or small it is. So that's how they differ. Another way that the both are similar is if you just look at their adaptations. Batman has very successful movies. Spider-Man has very successful movies. Both Spider-Man and Batman have been in 60 plus, have featured in 60 plus video games, whether it was a standalone game for them or they cameoed in it. They both have been in over 60 video games. No other comic book character comes close to that. None of them come close to that. It's because these characters are such good flagship characters that they can make money regardless how they're used. It doesn't matter if they're in a comic book or in a movie, a video game, a cartoon. Wherever these two characters are put, it's going to sell very, very well. Both Peter and Bruce, they were just regular kids. They had this, Bruce may have, Bruce started out as being a rich kid, but they're both just regular kids, all right? They weren't born on an alien planet, or they weren't cloned and created with abilities or anything like that. They were just basically average Joes, outside the fact that Bruce had money. They were basically just regular, run-of-the-mill kids. And they both experience pain and hardship. They both focus on fighting crime and protecting others. And they just do it differently. Batman, even though he has no superpowers, he is still a big icon and can stand up to someone like Superman. Much like how Spider-Man, he does have his, super strength and his spider sense and things, but he's still able to, keep up with the likes of, let's say, Captain America. Now, they both are different kind of symbols. Like I said earlier, Spider-Man, he's kind of like the Boy Scout symbol, similar to Superman, in that he'll go and he'll save more lives. He'll go and stop a drunk driver, or he'll, pull someone out of a fire, and just, do a lot of common acts of kindness and heroics, and be a positive symbol. Whereas Batman, he is more of a symbol to threaten that which is corrupt within the city. He's there to show that he's powerful and he wants to strike fear in his enemies, but he's not seen in the same light as like Spider-Man is. He's the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Everyone loves him, and they're not, if they see him, they want to go up and get a picture of him because he's this friendly, good, Boy Scout of a guy. Whereas Batman is a symbol of power and fear. If someone sees him, it's like, they have like that ooh, ah, like, oh my gosh, it's Batman. But like if Batman shows up next to you, you're gonna be scared. You're gonna be like, dude, I don't want to mess with this guy. I'm gonna leave. It's interesting how, despite all their similarities and their same origin stories and things like that, they've taken different routes in how they carry themselves. Seen as a different kind of symbol, they still have the same goals, and it's just kind of cool. Now, earlier I had talked about how Marvel and DC did a lot of copycatting, and this is where I feel like I ended up liking Batman and Spider-Man so much, is because they were so similar, and I was kind of vague before on, I went over like their origin story and stuff, but this is the copycatting part is the big part of how they kind of tie together as being the same. So up until now, if you were like Batman and Spider-Man are not the same. They don't have that many similarities. This is where the two really tie together, and it's the fact that all of like their side characters are basically the same. I can just list them off. So great examples would be Green Goblin or even Carnage. For Spider-Man, their equivalent would be Joker. Spider-Man has the Lizard. Batman has Killer Croc. You have Dr. Octopus, and then with Mr. Freeze, they're both, their abilities are different, but they're on the same scope with their scientific nature and the way they go about doing things. You have Venom and Bane. You have Spider-Man has Kingpin, and Batman has Carmine Falcone. You got Mysterio and the Riddler. All right, Vulture and Scarecrow. You can look at Kraven and Deadshot. Then there's Hammerhead and the Penguin. You even got your future stuff. You have Spider-Man 2099, and you have Batman Beyond. Okay, Ben Reilly and Dick Grayson. Kane Parker and Jason Todd. The list just goes on and on. You have Miles Morales, similar to Damian Wayne. Spider-Gwen basically is similar to, Batgirl. You have Silk and Black Bat. You have Sandman and Clayface. Catwoman and Black Cat. They have so many characters that are so similar. They're one and the same. The characters, the stories are one and the same in the sense, and that's why I'll sit there and argue that Batman and Spider-Man are the same. It's because they have so many similarities it flippin' hurts. But regardless of all these similarities, it's their small differences that set them apart. And they're just both really, really great. And I love them both. I love their characters. They're just very, very well done. But that's basically the end of it right there, between Spider-Man and Batman. So many things you can compare. And a lot of those things you might not have really paid too much attention to before. So I'm hoping now that I've, listed off these things, you'll sit there and you'll kind of think about how they, do compare, how they are similar in ways. Yes, they're going to have differences, but they're still, very, very the same, Catwoman and Black Cat. They're both, they're both villains. They're both love interests. They both are thieves. They both are modeled after a cat. It's a lot of things like that. Sandman and Clayface. They both manipulate, an earth form, sand or mud or whatever, clay. They both have an invulnerability. They are able to replicate or duplicate. They're basically the same thing. I would say Sandman's probably stronger, but if you just look at them at their core, they're basically the same. They're the same characters. And I feel growing up, that is what really helped me. I don't know. I see it as a plus. Other people might see it as a negative. Like, these guys they shouldn't be the same. They shouldn't have all these similarities. They should be different. Their enemies should be completely different. Stand apart, whatever. And normally I would agree, but I don't know. For some reason, when it comes to Batman and Spider-Man, I love that they're so similar because it's easier for me to follow them and understand what's going on because their stories are basically the same, and their enemies are basically the same. So it's an easy transition back and forth between the two. Another thing that I forgot to touch base on that was also a similarity between the two is Bruce Wayne has Wayne Enterprises, a huge conglomerate of a company that was handed over to him from his father, and then Bruce ended up, making it even bigger and better with his, technological, ideas. And then Parker, Peter, in an alternate universe, I think on like Earth 616 or whatever, there's like a different story arc there in that one, Peter Parker ends up having a multi-billion-dollar company called Parker Industries. So it's another similarity about them, both being strong, rich businessmen, as well as their alter ego of being heroes. But anyways, that's just some of my thoughts about Marvel versus DC. I'm not gonna say one's better than the other because it's literally, like I said, it's an argument that has been going on for like 80 years, and there's so many different ways to you can't. They go back and forth, like I said, DC started off stronger with with Superman and Batman being selling more comics than anything Marvel had, and then they started out with having better movies than Marvel had. Today you could say Marvel has the better feature films, and I would agree. I would agree if you look at the movies that came out within the last decade. Yeah, the Marvel universe is superior. They got the Avengers movies and Black Panther and things like that. Those were amazing movies, whereas the ones that DC dropped, Green Lantern and them, they weren't that good. They weren't as strong of films. But I would also argue then when you look at the animated movies, DC, the DC animated movies are, in my opinion, way superior to anything Marvel's got. And then if you look at like TV shows, I feel that they're about the same. I've looked at like their cartoons. Like if you look at the animated TV shows, I would say they are on equal footing. Both of them have great cartoons that and between Batman, Teen Titans, X-Men, Spider-Man, all them. They all have fantastic cartoons. So I say I say they're pretty equal when it comes to that. When it comes to TV shows, I feel DC's are a bit better. I tried watching, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and some of the Marvel ones, and I couldn't get into any of the Marvel shows. And honestly, they didn't do well. A lot of them got canceled within like their first year. They weren't that good in my opinion, whereas DC, even if the CW isn't for you, if you look at the shows and how long they've been running for, they're more successful. They, every DC, show within the Arrowverse and whatnot, they've all had at least, I think they're all on 5 seasons plus right now, whereas a lot of the Marvel ones, like Agent Carter and them, all got canceled after their first season. So it's pretty cut and dry that DC's kind of better when it comes to the TV shows. Even if you don't like CW, it's just a fact. Marvel has a lot more getting canceled, whereas all the ones DC puts out are long standing. Video games, both got really good video games too, and they got some crappy ones too. The Batman games are really good, Spider-Man games are really good, Superman games are shit. And you take a lot of some of the other Marvel ones and they're pretty crappy too when it comes to video games. So I mean, I'd say when it comes to video games, I feel they're kind of equal on that footing too. But yeah, so regardless of where your preference lies, I really don't think one is better than the other. Everybody wants to say no, Marvel is better. You got Wolverine and Deadpool, and we got the Punisher and all this stuff, and then you got DC with Batman and Superman and Green Arrow and Wonder Woman and all these other characters. Oh, there's another one, Green Arrow and Hawkeye. I don't know if I mentioned them. Green Arrow and Hawkeye. Boom. They're more copycatting. But yeah, I will not say one's better than the other. They all come with their own successes and their own failings. So yeah, I strongly believe neither is better than the other. However, I do have a preference for DC. I just prefer a lot of the DC characters over the Marvel ones. And like I said, if I have to pick one from each, hands down, Batman and Spider-Man are the best. There is a reason why they are the flagship characters for their publisher, because they are that good. Alright, they're just that good. And that's pretty much all I really got to say about Marvel vs. DC. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I feel like when most people go into Marvel vs. DC, they try to prove how one's better than the other. And I kind of went on a different direction with you guys to try to show how they're really... one isn't better than the other. They're you can just compare them and show how similar they are, despite some of their differences. And regardless of that, you know, it's fine if you have a preference to one or the other. You know, if you want, you know, if you prefer Marvel, that's totally fine. But I am not going to be someone who's going to sit here and argue with you and try to tell you that DC is better. I'm not going to do that. They're both really, really good. They both are really, really good. They have some amazing characters on both sides. But I am going to stay with DC as my preference. I want to thank you all for hanging out and giving it a listen. Feel free to leave a comment on Anchor, or you can send me a message on Twitter. If there was anything you want to discuss about what I said, I'm always open. You guys are amazing. Make sure you hit me with a follow. Just search Cool Cat Terry, and you can give me a follow on Twitch or Twitter or Instagram. Go ahead and follow the podcast. For those of you who are listening to it outside of Anchor, thank you. It is available on Spotify, Apple, and Google, as well as some other sites that it gets spread out to. So thank you for listening. Please, please, please recommend me to your friends and family if you enjoyed what you've been hearing thus far. I would really appreciate that. Word of mouth is very, very strong. It's the best way to grow. So please do. If you like it, please tell everybody you know. And thank you guys again, and I look forward to next week with our next great topic, whatever it may be. I will leave you guys up to another vote on Twitter. So thank you guys again, and catch you guys next time.